Hi, everybody. I'm Pastor Lutheran from Emmanuel. The purpose of what you're watching is to give you some idea of what I'm thinking about, praying about, studying about, the text that I'm going to talk about, or the texts that will be the focus or the foci in worship. And so the gospel is from St. Mark, the 4th chapter, and it's the story of Jesus stilling the storm. And I'm taping this on a Wednesday, and I've written most of it, and so I can give you a couple teasers. But what I often do, and it's important to do when you look at anything in a Bible study or you hear anything in a sermon, is what happened before and what happened after. Here's the thing, is this last week, if you were in worship, in that particular text, Jesus healed a man who was possessed by demons. This text happens right before. But what I'm going to do in my sermon on Sunday is that everything that happens, especially in the Gospel of Mark, which was the first one to be written and the shortest, because he kind of just truncates things and gets to the facts. Jesus, after John the Baptist, Jesus starts his ministry. He picks his 12 disciples. He goes on a kind of a tour of healing people, and then he tells a bunch of people parables, and then he tells the disciples what the parables mean. They get in a boat to go to the other side, and there's a big storm. And Jesus is in the back of the boat, asleep on his a flotation device, a little seat cushion, and they're worried because the waves are battering against the boat, and it looks like they're going to be swamped and drown. And they wake Jesus up and say, well, doesn't it seem to bother you that we're in trouble here? Jesus wakes up and says to the storm, be still, and it's stilled. But then he looks at the disciples after all the things they've gone through in the last couple of days. He healed a leper. He gave sight to someone who was blind. And he's thinking to themselves, have you no faith? And what's interesting, at least I noticed, is that he asked them a question about, do you have faith? But they didn't even answer that question. They were like, doesn't it kind of blow your mind that even the wind and the rain and the waves follow Jesus? And that's the end of that episode. You know what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about there are storms in our life. And the waves batter us and our lives and our souls and our hopes and our dreams. And we actually sometimes and oftentimes in prayer will go to Jesus, who we think is asleep at the back of the boat, and saying, hey, I'm in trouble here. Doesn't seem to bother you. So we are really no different. We are no better. We are no worse. But the great thing is, and the title of the sermon is, when you're in the boat with Jesus, ... So I want you to think about the storms in your life, the times when you've been full of fear, and then we pray and we still worry, and Jesus will say, didn't I tell you not to have fear? Didn't I tell you to not despair? And we'll say, yeah, we tried, but we need you. And that's the story, not only for this Sunday, the story of our faith with Jesus, but every single time. In the end, he stills the storm. Even though we fear, even though we worry, Jesus never worries and never fears. Therefore, we ought not to as well. Meantime, be well. See you on Sunday. God bless.
Hello, this is Pastor Rick. I want to welcome you once again to Lectionary Plus. Thank you, Pastor Lilliard, for that word in preparation for the sermon on Sunday. We also want to take a look at two texts that will be readings for Sunday from Luke chapter 9. We've been in this chapter for a couple weeks now, and then a wonderful story from 1 Kings 19, 15 to 16, and 19 through 21. Now, let's start with 1 Kings, because that's kind of the bedrock. That's the story that's going to lead us into the story from Jesus in Luke 9. It's about Elijah and Elisha. Just to remind you about the backstory, Elijah had his mountaintop experience where he killed or had killed all the prophets of Baal. And then he is threatened by the king, Ahab and Jezebel. And despite his victory, despite winning for the Lord, he flees. He gets frightened. He goes out into the wilderness, ends up in a cave where he has this famous engagement with God, where God is not in the thunder and the lightning and the storms and the wind, but he goes to the mouth of the cave, and there he senses God's presence in the silence. But here's the key. He's been disobedient. God had gave him all these things to do, and now he just didn't do them. So you can feel in the story that the mantle of leadership is changing. And both these stories are about discipleship and leadership. And so, as part of that transition, God calls Elijah to go and bless another leader. Another will become now prophet, and that's Elisha. And he finds him plowing the fields. That's interesting. He had 12 oxen. And Elijah puts the mantle over him, and immediately it's like Elisha knew the gravitas of what had just happened. And he just says, I will follow, I will take up this mantle, I will do the work, but let me say goodbye first to my father. But then Elijah gives this interesting rebuttal, and he says, what have I done to you? And commentators don't know how to interpret that. It might be, oh, what have I done to you? Have I put you in this place now where you have to reject your parents, your livelihood? Oh, the burden, the responsibility is too great. Or is he trying to say something else? Are you ready? But he kills the oxen, he feeds the whole community, and he goes, as we know, fulfills the role. Now, Jesus is referring to this story in Luke chapter 9. And here he's trying to get into a Samaritan city. He sends the disciples ahead to prepare the way. When he gets there, however, he's rejected by the city. Now, this is the second city that has rejected Jesus. He just got, last week, rejected in the city of the Gerasenes. Remember, he cast out the demons, he kills the pigs, and the city fathers come out and say, get out of here. We're nervous about you. Now he goes to the Jewish side of the lake. Once again, the Samaritans now reject him. They don't want anything to do with him because he's on his way to Jerusalem. And therefore, then Jesus says, talking about discipleship, someone says, I will follow you. And he says, foxes have holes, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. All right. I've not been accepted here in this town, as an example. And another one he says, follow me. And the guy says, why not? First, I got to go home. I got to put my house in order. He says, well, let the dead bury the dead. Even burial rituals shouldn't get in the way of the call. That's the implication. And then, of course, someone says, I will follow you. And he says, anyone who puts his hand to the plow, again, referring to Elisha, and turns back is not worthy to be my disciple. Well, this raises up all sorts of questions that we'll be hearing in the sermon about leadership and discipleship and what it means, not just for you, but for a whole congregation to put their hands on the plow. Thanks for joining us for this Lectionary Plus. Bye-bye now.